The billionaire thought a machine had failed. He had no idea the only person who could save his factory was already working the night shift. At 4:37 on a cold Tuesday morning, the emergency call reached Richard Hayes while he was still asleep. Within seconds, the $60 billion manufacturing empire he had spent 3 decades building seemed to tilt beneath his feet. One of Hayes Manufacturing's largest facilities outside Columbus, Ohio, had suddenly stopped operating. Entire production lines were frozen. Automated systems refused to restart. Orders worth millions of dollars sat unfinished. Every hour the factory remained down cost the company an astonishing amount of money. Richard sat upright in bed as his phone continued ringing. The voice on the other end sounded tense. "We have engineers on site. Nobody knows what happened." Richard swung his feet onto the floor and stared out the window into the darkness. This particular facility was not just another factory. It was one of the company's most important operations, supplying specialized industrial components to customers across the country. Missing delivery deadlines could trigger penalties, damage relationships, and threaten contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Less than 90 minutes later, Richard's private vehicle rolled through the factory gates. Red warning lights flashed near several production areas. Supervisors moved quickly across the floor. Maintenance crews stood around open equipment panels. The normal rhythm of the plant had vanished. Instead of machinery humming and conveyors moving, an uneasy silence filled the massive building. Richard entered the control center where engineers crowded around computer screens. Charts, diagnostics, and system alerts covered every monitor. Nobody looked confident. "What do we know?" Richard asked. One senior engineer rubbed his forehead. "We know the shutdown spread through multiple systems at the same time." Another shook his head. "We have checked power distribution, automation controls, and network communication. Everything points somewhere different." Richard looked around the room. Some of the smartest technical specialists in the company stood before him. Yet nobody appeared close to an answer. The atmosphere felt heavier with every passing minute. Outside the control center, workers gathered in small groups discussing rumors. Some worried about layoffs. Others worried about missed production goals. Everyone knew this factory mattered. Everyone knew the company could not afford a prolonged shutdown. Several miles away, a woman named Megan Carter was finishing another ordinary night shift. At 47 years old, she had spent more than 2 decades inside this factory. She knew every section of the building. She knew the sounds machines made when operating correctly and the sounds they made when something was wrong. Yet, despite her experience, very few people outside maintenance paid much attention to her. She was simply part of the background. Reliable, quiet, easy to overlook. As she walked across the factory floor carrying a toolbox, she noticed something unusual. Not the silence. Everyone noticed that. Something else. A detail so small most people would never think twice about it. Megan slowed her pace and listened carefully. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Somewhere inside the enormous facility, hidden beneath the confusion, she thought she heard a clue. And while executives, engineers, and managers searched desperately for answers, the woman nobody was watching had already begun asking the right question. Most people inside the factory believed the problem was too complicated for a maintenance technician to understand. That assumption would soon become their biggest mistake. Megan Carter stopped beside a section of inactive conveyor equipment and listened again. The factory remained unusually quiet, but buried beneath the silence was a faint rhythmic clicking sound. Came and went every few seconds. To most people it sounded meaningless. To Megan it sounded familiar. She stood motionless for nearly a minute, concentrating. 23 years inside the plant had taught her something no training manual could provide. Machines spoke constantly. Most workers heard noise. Megan heard patterns. She slowly walked toward the source of the sound. Along the way, she passed groups of supervisors discussing production losses and maintenance crews reviewing diagnostic reports. Nobody paid much attention to her. They were focused on engineers, consultants, and managers. Those were the people expected to solve major problems. Megan eventually reached an equipment corridor connecting several automated systems. The clicking seemed louder here. She crouched beside a control cabinet and examined a series of indicator lights. Everything appeared normal. That bothered her. When machines stop, something usually reveals itself. A warning light, an error code, a temperature fluctuation. This system looked almost too normal. Meanwhile, inside the control center, pressure continued building. Richard Hayes stood beside a large digital display showing production losses increasing minute by minute. Senior engineers reviewed technical reports while outside consultants joined conference calls. Every proposed explanation led to another dead end. One specialist believed the issue originated in software. Another suspected a communication failure between automation systems. A third recommended replacing multiple components entirely. None of them could prove their theories. Richard's frustration grew. How can a facility this large simply stop? Nobody answered immediately. Finally, one engineer spoke. "We are still gathering data." Richard stared at the screens. Data was not what he needed. He needed results. Back on the factory floor, Megan continued tracing the unusual sound through several sections of the plant. Eventually, she arrived near an older piece of infrastructure that most employees rarely thought about anymore. Years earlier, newer systems had been installed around it. The equipment still played an important role, but because it operated reliably, people often forgot it existed. Megan studied it carefully. Her eyes moved across gauges, wiring, and control indicators. Then she noticed something. One reading appeared slightly different than she remembered. Not dramatically different, just enough to catch her attention. She checked it again, then compared it to another nearby system. A small frown appeared on her face. The numbers did not match what they should have been. At that moment, a maintenance supervisor walked past. Megan called out to him, "Can I ask you something?" The supervisor stopped. "Make it quick. Everyone is busy." Megan pointed toward the equipment. "Has anyone checked this section?" The supervisor glanced at it briefly. The engineers already reviewed everything important. Then he continued walking. Megan looked back at the equipment. Everything important. The words lingered in her mind. Sometimes the biggest problems hid inside places nobody considered important anymore. She pulled out a notepad and wrote down several readings. Then she followed a cable route leading deeper into the facility. The further she investigated, the more a troubling possibility began forming in her mind. She was not certain yet, not even close. But if her suspicion proved correct, the experts searching for answers were looking in entirely the wrong direction. And somewhere inside the massive factory, a very old piece of equipment was quietly waiting to tell its story. By mid-morning, the factory had become a magnet for experts. Additional engineers arrived from regional offices. Outside consultants rolled equipment cases across the production floor. Specialists gathered around monitors displaying endless streams of diagnostic data. Everywhere Megan Carter looked, people were searching for answers. Yet despite the growing crowd, the factory remained silent. Conveyor belts stood motionless. Robotic systems waited in frozen positions. Production targets continued slipping further out of reach. Inside the control center, Richard Hayes watched another presentation from a consulting team flown in earlier that morning. Their lead engineer pointed toward a series of charts. "We believe the problem may originate within the automation network." Another specialist immediately disagreed. "The automation network is responding normally. The root cause is probably electrical." A third expert proposed replacing several major components. The discussion continued for nearly an hour. Each theory sounded convincing until someone tested it. Then it collapsed. Richard listened carefully but heard the same thing repeated over and over. Assumptions, possibilities, guesses. Nobody seemed to know. Meanwhile, Megan continued following the trail that had begun with the strange clicking sound. She reviewed maintenance records stored on a terminal near the production floor. Most employees rarely bothered reading old reports. Megan read them constantly. She believed machines left clues long before they failed completely. The records revealed something interesting. Several months earlier, technicians had documented intermittent irregularities, involving an older support system connected indirectly to multiple production lines. The issue had never become serious enough to trigger concern. Temporary adjustments appeared to solve it each time. Megan studied the reports carefully. The dates caught her attention. The intervals between incidents had gradually become shorter. That was not random. That was a pattern. She printed several pages and carried them toward the equipment corridor she had examined earlier. Along the way, she passed a group of engineers discussing system architecture. One noticed the reports in her hand. "Looking for something?" he asked casually. Megan nodded. "Maybe." The engineer smiled politely. "Trust me. If the answer was in maintenance records, we would have found it already." Several others chuckled softly before returning to their conversation. Megan simply continued walking. She had heard similar comments before. Experience taught her that arguing rarely changed minds. Results did. Back near the older infrastructure section, she compared current readings against historical maintenance logs. The differences were subtle but undeniable. One value appeared consistently outside its normal operating range. Not enough to trigger alarms. Not enough to stop production directly, but enough to create instability under certain conditions. Megan followed another cable route and discovered additional evidence supporting her suspicion. The deeper she looked, the more convinced she became that the shutdown was not caused by a dramatic failure. It was caused by a small problem that had quietly grown for years. Inside the control center, frustration continued mounting. Richard received updates from customers waiting on delayed shipments. Supervisors worried about production schedules. Engineers searched for increasingly complicated explanations. Nobody seemed interested in simple ones. As afternoon approached, Megan stood beside a section of aging equipment and stared at a worn identification plate attached to the side. Her eyes narrowed. There it was, a detail everyone else had overlooked. Tiny, unremarkable, easy to dismiss. Yet the moment she saw it, the pieces began fitting together. And for the first time since the factory stopped, Megan believed she knew where the real problem was hiding. The worn identification plate attached to the side of the equipment should not have mattered. At least that was what most people would have assumed. Yet Megan Carter knew better. She wiped away a thin layer of dust and studied the serial information more carefully. The manufacturing date matched the records she had reviewed earlier. The service history matched as well. But one small detail did not. Her eyes moved back and forth between the plate and the maintenance reports in her hand. Then she slowly exhaled. Someone had replaced part of the system years ago without updating the documentation correctly. To most employees, that sounded insignificant. To Megan, it explained everything. The replacement component belonged to a different operating series. It looked nearly identical to the original equipment, but the performance characteristics were slightly different. Under normal conditions, nobody would notice. Under heavy production loads, however, small timing variations could spread through connected systems. Megan immediately understood why engineers had been struggling. They were analyzing the factory based on documentation that was technically wrong. Every diagnostic model they built started from an incorrect assumption. She gathered her notes and headed toward the control center. Inside, another meeting was underway. Richard Hayes stood beside several engineers while consultants reviewed fresh data on large monitors. Nobody looked optimistic. One specialist pointed at a graph. The fault appears to be propagating through multiple automation layers. Another nodded. We are considering a complete system reset. Richard crossed his arms. How long? The answer was not encouraging. Several days at minimum, perhaps longer. The room grew quieter. Every additional hour meant more financial damage. At that moment, Megan entered carrying her notes. Nobody paid much attention at first. She waited patiently near the doorway. Eventually, one supervisor noticed her. Can I help you? Megan held up the maintenance reports. I think I found something. Several engineers exchanged tired expressions. One consultant glanced briefly toward her before returning to the monitors. Maintenance findings can be forwarded through normal channels, he said. Megan remained calm. I believe the documentation is wrong. That statement finally captured attention. A few heads turned. The consultant frowned. Wrong how? Megan stepped forward and explained what she had discovered. She described the replacement component, the mismatched records, and the performance differences between the two equipment series. Several engineers listened politely. Others appeared skeptical. When she finished, one consultant shook his head. That would not explain a facility-wide shutdown. A few people nodded in agreement. Megan expected the reaction. Not by itself, she said. But if the timing drift accumulated over time, it could affect every connected system. The room fell briefly silent. One engineer opened a maintenance database and began reviewing records. Another compared serial numbers. Minutes passed. Then something unexpected happened. The engineer studying the records slowly sat back in his chair. The serial numbers do not match. Another engineer checked independently. Neither do these installation logs. Suddenly the room became much quieter. Richard watched the exchange carefully. For the first time all day, he saw something he had not seen from his experts. Surprise. Genuine surprise. Megan stood quietly while engineers reviewed her findings. Nobody was laughing now. Nobody was dismissing her. The evidence sat directly in front of them. Yet even as the room absorbed the discovery, Megan sensed they still had not reached the true source of the problem. The incorrect documentation explained why everyone was lost. It did not explain why the factory had stopped. Somewhere deeper inside the system, another answer was still waiting. And as afternoon sunlight faded across the factory floor, Megan knew she was getting closer. By early evening, word had spread throughout the factory that a maintenance technician had discovered something the experts missed. The story changed slightly each time it traveled across the building. Some workers claimed she had identified a hidden defect. Others believed she had uncovered an installation mistake from years earlier. Whatever version people heard, one fact remained the same. The factory was still not running. Inside the control center, engineers continued analyzing the evidence Megan Carter had uncovered. Large screens displayed updated system maps. Diagnostic reports were being revised. Assumptions that guided the investigation all day were now being questioned. Richard Hayes remained present through every discussion. He had canceled meetings, delayed travel plans, and ignored countless phone calls. Nothing mattered more than getting the factory back online. Yet, despite the progress, frustration lingered. Megan's discovery explained why the technical teams had been chasing the wrong problem. It still did not explain the shutdown itself. The missing piece remained hidden. Megan stood near the back of the room listening carefully. Several engineers debated possible scenarios. One suggested replacing the mismatched component immediately. Another argued that doing so might create additional complications. A consultant recommended waiting until a complete review could be performed. Hours passed. Discussions grew longer. Solutions remained elusive. Finally, Richard looked around the room. "Are we any closer than we were this morning?" Nobody answered immediately. The silence spoke for itself. As the meeting ended, many of the specialists prepared to continue working overnight. Others left briefly to gather more data. Megan quietly collected her notes. Her shift had officially ended hours ago. Nobody expected her to stay. Yet something continued bothering her. The explanation still felt incomplete. She walked back onto the factory floor and retraced the route she had followed earlier. The building felt different now. The usual sounds of production were gone. Without machinery running, even small noises seemed louder. Footsteps echoed through empty sections. Warning lights blinked above inactive equipment. The enormous facility felt almost abandoned. Megan eventually returned to the aging support system that first attracted her attention. She examined it again, this time ignoring every assumption made during the day. Instead of focusing on the shutdown, she focused on the clicking sound that started everything. It was still there, faint, rhythmic, persistent. She closed her eyes and listened. Then she followed the sound deeper into the equipment network. Several access corridors later, she arrived at a section rarely visited by anyone outside maintenance. The area housed supporting infrastructure installed decades earlier. Most employees barely knew it existed. Megan checked a series of readings and immediately noticed another inconsistency. Then another. The pattern spread farther than she expected. She pulled out her flashlight and examined several connection points. A realization slowly began forming. The shutdown was not the result of one failure. It was the result of multiple small problems building upon each other over many years. The experts kept searching for a dramatic cause because dramatic causes were easier to find. Reality was messier. Reality had been whispering warnings for a long time. Megan looked at the clock. Night had fully settled outside. Most people would have gone home. Instead, she grabbed additional tools from the maintenance room and headed back toward the forgotten section of the factory. Somewhere ahead, hidden beneath years of overlooked details, the real answer was finally beginning to reveal itself. The factory grew quieter as the night deepened. Most offices were dark. Many of the consultants had retreated to temporary workspaces to review data. Engineers rotated through shifts, hoping fresh eyes might uncover what everyone else had missed. Yet, in a forgotten corner of the facility, Megan Carter continued working alone. Her flashlight cut through the dim light as she moved methodically between aging support systems that had quietly served the factory for decades. The deeper she investigated, the clearer the pattern became. Every clue pointed toward the same conclusion. The shutdown had not started where the experts were looking. It had started far upstream, inside infrastructure so old and reliable that nobody thought to question it. Megan followed a series of maintenance pathways connecting multiple systems. Along the way, she reviewed inspection tags, service records, and component histories. The story slowly revealed itself. Years earlier, a replacement part had been installed. Later, a temporary adjustment compensated for a small performance issue. Then another adjustment was added. And another. Each change solved a short-term problem while creating a slightly larger long-term one. Individually, none of them seemed dangerous. Together, they formed a chain reaction waiting to happen. Megan crouched beside a control housing and carefully removed an access panel. Inside, she found exactly what she expected. Not a catastrophic failure. Not a broken machine. Something far more difficult to detect. A component that had gradually drifted outside its intended operating range. The deviation was small enough to avoid alarms but large enough to disrupt timing across interconnected systems. Over the years, software adaptations and manual adjustments masked the symptoms. Eventually, the accumulated instability became too great. When one final condition aligned, the entire production network shut itself down to protect critical equipment. Megan sat back and stared at the component. For the first time all day, she felt certain. She had found the source. Yet certainty created a new challenge, convincing everyone else. Inside the control center, Richard Hayes remained awake despite nearly 20 hours of nonstop pressure. Coffee cups covered nearby tables. Engineers continued debating theories. New reports arrived constantly. None offered a solution. Richard looked exhausted. The factory represented millions of dollars in lost production. More importantly, thousands of employees depended on its success. He refused to leave until answers appeared. Shortly after midnight, Megan entered the control center carrying a small equipment case and a folder of notes. Several engineers looked up. Their expressions had changed since earlier in the day. The dismissive attitude was gone. Now they listened. Megan placed her findings on the table and calmly explained the sequence of events she had reconstructed. She described the replacement component, the undocumented modifications, the accumulated timing drift, the protective shutdown. As she spoke, engineers reviewed the evidence. One by one, they stopped asking skeptical questions and started asking technical ones. Richard watched the exchange carefully. Every answer Megan provided connected logically to the next. Nothing sounded exaggerated. Nothing sounded lucky. It sounded like someone who truly understood the factory. Finally, one senior engineer finished reviewing the data and slowly nodded. "I think she is right." The room fell silent. Another engineer checked the calculations independently. He reached the same conclusion. Around the table, faces changed. For the first time since the crisis began, a path forward had emerged. Yet the repair itself would not be simple. The factory could not be restarted with a single button. The damaged chain had to be carefully rebuilt. And while everyone else prepared plans and procedures, Megan quietly gathered her tools. Because she already knew where she would be spending the rest of the night. After midnight, the factory became a world divided in two. Inside conference rooms and control centers, teams of engineers built recovery plans, reviewed safety procedures, and prepared system validation checklists. On the factory floor, however, the real work had already begun. Megan Carter moved through the maze of equipment with a level of familiarity that no consultant could match. Every corridor, every access panel, every maintenance route felt as familiar to her as the rooms of her own home. The component she had identified was only one piece of a much larger chain. Years of temporary fixes had created dependencies throughout the system. Correcting the root problem required carefully unwinding those changes without creating new failures. It was the kind of task that demanded patience rather than speed. Several engineers joined her during the first few hours. They followed her explanations, checked readings, and assisted with documentation. Yet the longer the work continued, the more obvious something became. Megan understood how the factory behaved in the real world, not just on diagrams and schematics. She remembered maintenance decisions made years earlier. She remembered unusual incidents that never appeared in reports. She remembered conversations with retired technicians who had helped install some of the original equipment. The factory was not simply machinery to her. It was a living system she had watched evolve for more than 2 decades. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, Richard Hayes left the control center and walked onto the production floor. Exhaustion showed on every face he passed. Maintenance crews worked under bright industrial lighting. Engineers monitored test equipment. Supervisors coordinated activities between departments. Near one of the older infrastructure sections, Richard spotted Megan reviewing a series of measurements. For a moment, he simply watched. The woman standing beside the equipment looked nothing like the specialists his company normally trusted during major crises. She wore practical work clothes. Her hands carried years of experience. There was nothing dramatic about her appearance. Yet nearly every meaningful breakthrough during the past 18 hours had originated from her observations. Richard approached quietly. "How much longer?" Megan studied the readings before answering. "I do not know exactly." Richard nodded. "But," she looked up, "but I think the factory wants to run again." The answer surprised him. Not because it sounded technical, because it sounded personal. Megan glanced toward the production lines stretching into the distance. Machines usually tell you what they need if you listen long enough. Richard looked around the silent facility. For the first time, he began understanding something his experts had missed. Megan was not solving a puzzle. She was listening to something she knew intimately. As the night continued, adjustments were completed one by one. Systems were recalibrated. Timing relationships were restored. Protective parameters were reviewed. Every successful step increased confidence. Shortly before 4 in the morning, a final series of diagnostic checks began. Engineers gathered around monitoring stations. Supervisors positioned themselves throughout the facility. Richard returned to the control center. The atmosphere felt different now. Not hopeful exactly. Focused. The kind of focus that appears when people sense they are standing at the edge of an answer. Megan remained near the original infrastructure section where the problem had started. She watched indicators cycle through their sequences. One by one, systems reported healthy status. Then another. Then another. A quiet smile appeared on her face. Somewhere deep inside the factory, something had changed. The hidden chain of failures that had stopped everything was finally breaking apart. And as the first signs of life began returning to the system, dawn moved steadily closer outside the factory walls. At 5:12 in the morning, the first major system reported ready status. The notification appeared on monitors throughout the control center. Engineers immediately checked the readings. Everything looked normal. No warnings. No irregularities. A few minutes later, A second system completed its validation sequence. Then a third. Across the factory, maintenance crews watched indicator lights change from cautionary yellow to steady green. The building seemed to be waking up after a long and restless night. Richard Hayes stood near the main operations display, his eyes fixed on the screens. Around him, engineers monitored every piece of incoming data. Nobody wanted to celebrate prematurely. The shutdown had already embarrassed some of the brightest technical minds in the company. They needed proof before they believed anything. On the factory floor, Megan Carter remained beside the infrastructure section where the chain of failures had originated. Her hands were dirty. Her shoulders ached. She had been working for hours with almost no rest. Yet her attention never wavered. She listened carefully as systems synchronized one by one. To most people, the sounds were ordinary. Small relays engaging, motors preparing for operation, control circuits communicating. To Megan, they sounded like pieces of a conversation finally making sense again. At 5:43, the lead engineer received confirmation that every critical subsystem had passed testing. He looked around the control center. "We are ready for a controlled restart." Nobody spoke for a moment. This was the moment everyone had been working toward since the previous morning. Richard slowly nodded. "Do it." The command traveled through the facility. Supervisors confirmed readiness. Operators moved into position. Engineers watched diagnostic screens. Then the restart sequence began. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then a conveyor motor activated. The sound echoed through the enormous building. A second conveyor followed. Then another. Automated systems began reporting active status. Robotic stations moved through initialization cycles. Across the production floor, lights flashed in carefully timed patterns. One by one, machines returned to life. Employees stopped what they were doing and stared. Some smiled. Others simply watched in disbelief. The factory that had stood silent for more than a day was moving again. Richard walked out onto an elevated observation platform overlooking the main production area. Below him, conveyors carried materials forward. Robotic equipment resumed operations. Digital displays updated production metrics. Everywhere he looked, motion had returned. The facility was alive. Yet what caught his attention most was not the machinery. It was the woman standing quietly near the back of the production floor. Megan was not celebrating. She was not giving interviews. She was not explaining her accomplishment. She was simply watching the equipment operate, making sure everything sounded right. Around her, engineers who had once dismissed her observations now reviewed the notes she created. Supervisors who barely noticed her before were suddenly asking questions. The entire atmosphere had changed. As sunlight began streaming through high factory windows, production numbers continued climbing. The restart was working. Every minute brought additional confirmation. The crisis was ending. Richard remained on the observation platform, staring across the enormous facility. The experts had searched everywhere. They had examined software, networks, automation systems, and control architecture. The answer had been hidden inside years of overlooked details that only one person noticed. And as the last sections of the factory returned to operation beneath the growing morning light, a realization settled across the building. The woman everyone overlooked had done what nobody else could. The room did not erupt into cheers. It did something far more powerful. It fell silent. The factory operated smoothly throughout the morning. What had seemed impossible less than 24 hours earlier was now reality. Production lines moved steadily. Orders resumed processing. Supervisors updated schedules. Engineers monitored systems that only hours before had appeared hopelessly broken. Everywhere employees looked, the facility was functioning exactly as it should. Yet the story spreading through the building was no longer about machinery. It was about Megan Carter. Workers discussed her discovery in break rooms and hallways. Maintenance crews repeated details of the long night. Even employees from departments far removed from production wanted to know how a quiet technician had solved a problem that defeated teams of experts. Megan, however, seemed almost unaffected by the attention. After confirming that the repaired systems remained stable, she returned several tools to the maintenance shop and began organizing paperwork. To her, the crisis was over. The work still needed to be documented correctly. That mattered just as much as the repair itself. Shortly before noon, Richard Hayes requested a gathering on the factory floor. Supervisors, engineers, managers, and employees gradually assembled near the main production area. The massive equipment continued operating in the background, creating a steady rhythm that now sounded almost reassuring. Megan arrived expecting another technical briefing. Instead, she found hundreds of people looking in her direction. The attention immediately made her uncomfortable. Richard stepped forward. The billionaire appeared more rested than he had the previous day, though traces of exhaustion remained visible. He looked across the crowd before speaking. Yesterday morning, many of us believed this factory was facing one of the worst operational failures in its history. The room grew quiet. We brought in specialists. We reviewed reports. We examined every explanation we could find. He paused and glanced toward the production lines. None of it solved the problem. Employees listened carefully. Richard then turned toward Megan. The person who found the answer was not a consultant, not an executive, not an outside expert. A hush fell across the floor. It was someone who spent years paying attention when nobody else did. Megan lowered her eyes slightly. Around her, employees nodded. Some smiled. Others exchanged knowing looks. They had worked alongside her for years. Many suddenly realized how much they had taken her presence for granted. Richard continued. The truth is simple. This factory is running today because one person refused to stop looking. The room fell completely silent. Then something unexpected happened. The first applause came from one of the engineers who had challenged Megan's theory earlier. Others quickly joined. Within seconds, the entire area filled with applause. It was not loud because people felt obligated. It was loud because they meant it. Megan stood motionless, overwhelmed by the reaction. Richard waited until the applause faded. Then he walked toward her. For a brief moment, the billionaire and the maintenance technician stood facing each other in front of the entire factory. Richard extended his hand. Thank you. Megan accepted the handshake. I was just doing my job. Richard smiled. Maybe, but you did it better than the rest of us. Laughter spread through the crowd. The tension that had dominated the previous day finally disappeared. Months later, employees would still tell the story. Not because a factory broke down. Factories break down all the time. They remembered because a woman everyone overlooked revealed what real expertise looked like. And on that morning, as machines hummed steadily and sunlight filled the building, everyone learned the same lesson. Titles may earn attention, but wisdom is earned by years of listening. And sometimes the person who saves everything is the one nobody thought to notice.